Syria run by this man. It seems to me wanting Assad to leave power, to me it's, and saying he can't be part of a future Syria is not so much a question of political preference, it's a sort of statement of political fact. I don't think you can have a stable Syria with Assad in charge. So therefore I don't really go down your comparison.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem surely is...
But where I agree with you is lessons to be learned from previous conflicts in terms of not dismantling states, in terms of having plans for reconstruction, in terms of thinking through political process. I agree with all of that. I think there's a lot of common ground.
Well, it seems to me, Prime Minister, that you still subscribe to the view that there is a third alternative, which is some form of inclusive democracy. And some of us take the view that we have to choose the lesser of two evils. But let's assume then that we are going down the route of saying that there is a third option, and that option are opposition moderates. Now, we all know that in order to be decisive, airstrikes need to act in support of credible forces on the ground. And you famously told the Commons, and you've repeated it again today, that the Joint Intelligence Committee estimate there to be 70,000 moderate fighters whom we can support. Now, if these people are fighters, there can be little grounds for secrecy about their identity. So why won't you or the Defence Secretary name the supposedly moderate groups in whose name these fighters are in the field?
Well, first of all, let's be clear about the terminology. The figure I gave to the House of Commons is not a figure that I invented. It's a figure I asked the JIC for, to give me their best estimate. And their estimate was that there were 70,000 non-extremist opposition fighters in Syria. The largest number of these is the Free Syrian Army, who we're familiar with. As I said, the representatives who all turned up at the Riyadh conference all signed up to the Geneva Principles. But if you're arguing, are all of these people impeccable Democrats who would share the view of democracy that you and I have? No. Some of them do belong to Islamist groups, and some of them belong to relatively hard-line Islamist groups. But nonetheless, that's the best estimate of the people that we have potentially to work with. The reason for not breaking down in huge amounts of granular detail exactly who they are is simply this, that we'd be effectively giving President Assad a sort of list of the groups and the people and potentially the areas that he should be targeting, and that's not my approach.
But surely, Prime Minister, I mean, lists have been published by people supportive of your position on this, which have identified well-known groups of various sizes, including the Free Syrian Army, that does have a large number of very small and disparate affiliates to it. And the suspicion has to be that if the government won't name these supposedly moderate groups, it becomes impossible for any sensible assessment to be made of whether they really are moderate or whether they are Islamist and extreme.
Well, our reason for not publishing is the reason I've given. I don't want to give... it's different, other people publishing this, to the government officially publishing a list. I'm being very frank with you, and I always was in the debate. I said, if people want to say there aren't enough opposition ground troops, I totally agree. They're not all in the right places. I couldn't agree more. They're not all the sort of people you'd bump into at a Liberal Democrat Party conference. Correct. I would agree with all those assessments. But the point I would make is that because you go back to this, is there a third way? Is there a third way between a Daesh-style state and President Assad, the butcher, remaining in charge of this country? My answer would be there has to be a third way. We have to find a third way. It should involve, of course, people who, Alawites, perhaps even who've taken part in the state run by Assad. We don't want to dismantle that. But to argue that the Sunni majority in Syria simply are too extreme or too hopeless or too whatever to take part in the future running of their country, I think is a counsel of despair. And we have to try and find this third way. And to be fair to these opposition groups who pitched up at the meeting in Riyadh, who signed up to the Geneva Principles, is that, a large number of them do want to see some form of diverse, democratic regime in Syria that we should be supporting. So I don't think we have a lot of choice but to back that. And on the numbers, I mean, to be clear, the 70,000 doesn't include the 20,000 Kurdish fighters in Syria. And the other point I make to people who say, well, somehow this 70,000 is a chimera or doesn't properly exist. I mean, if it doesn't exist, what on earth of the 240,000 troops that Assad has, who have they been fighting for the last 4 years?
Prime Minister, I have no doubt at all that there are a large number of troops in Syria who have been, or I should say fighters in Syria, who have been fighting Assad. The question is, are they moderate or not? And I'd just like to quote to you an answer that came, slightly more informative answer than the one I got when I asked who were the groups that were being classed as moderate. And this was a question which was answered by the Defence Secretary. He was asked which moderate non-Islamist groups with credible ground forces other than Kurds are fighting Daesh in Syria. He was asked that on the in October on the 19th, and he replied on the 26th as follows: there are a number of moderate opposition forces focused on fighting the Assad regime. Many are also fighting ISIL in areas of strategic importance, for example, north of Aleppo. The vast majority of these opposition groups are Islamist. Now, unless there's a mistake in the Secretary of State's answer, it reveals that what the government regards as moderate groups are actually, in many cases, Islamist ones. And that's why I urge you again that if you want people to be able to make an informed choice between the options of a secular, brutal dictator and an Islamist alternative, we really ought to be told more about the composition of the allegedly moderate forces that we are now mounting airstrikes to support.
Well, I've given you my answer about what we're going to publish, and I'm not going to change that answer. What I'd repeat again, though, that yes, some of the opposition forces are Islamist, some of them are relatively hardline Islamist, and some of them are more what we would describe as more secular Democrats. But I would make the point there are groups like Al-Nusra Front or Jundal Aqsa who we wouldn't work with, who we condemn, who, you know. So I think, but if you're arguing there aren't enough, we need to build them up. Okay. Yes, we do. There aren't enough of them. I agree. We've got to start somewhere.
We're running over the same ground.
I know, but that's the point. Every day we don't support moderate forces, they are hit by Assad and attrited further.
Have you not considered that there might be something between this huge granular detail, as you put it, that might give assistance to Assad on the one hand, and some general information that might give more credibility to that number, which you could put into the public domain?
Well, I've considered it, but I've given the answer I think is appropriate.
Because without it, people are going to wonder whether this is a reliable number.
Well, look, all I can say is, we had an NSC discussion. The JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee, produced the figure. I questioned and probed on the figure. They said they thought 70,000 was the best estimate of non-extremist opposition fighters. The Americans have said that is within their estimates. To be absolutely transparent with you, the Americans said it was towards the top end of their estimates. Yeah. And, if you want to say that the JIC mislead me or Parliament.
Well, of course, we don't want to say anything particular.
But you would always. You're saying no one's going to believe me unless I give more detail. Well, I think that's why we have a JIC. It was set up after the Iraq War for precisely this purpose. So the Prime Minister
said no one's going to believe you
Parliament,
either. I've said it's going to increase your credibility if you come forward with some detail. But I think you've made clear you're not going to. Is it fair to say that the Libyan intervention, after we went into Syria to degrade ISIL, that the Libyan intervention has deprived the region of one of ISIL's most ruthless opponents in Gaddafi?
Well, it's certainly true that Gaddafi was, particularly in his latter days, an opponent of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, and he worked famously with the last government towards that end. But I don't think in any way we should look back fondly to the time of Gaddafi.
No one's suggesting that.
No, but it's important because sometimes
we're just
people
asking whether we've lost a character there who, for all his manifest shortcomings, and he was an extremely nasty piece of work, was at least on the right side on the main reason you've gone into Syria.
Towards the end of his time in office, he might have been on the right side of that issue. But, we are still dealing in Northern Ireland with Semtex given to the IRA by Gaddafi. So I don't look back and think that was somehow a golden era in Libyan relations. Look, we have a problem now with a growing ISIL franchise in Libya, just as we have a problem with growing ISIL franchises in many countries around the world. And the truth is that we are dealing with an extremist, violent ideology that is taking hold in all states that are fractured or broken or insufficient in any way. And you see that with Boko Haram in Nigeria, you see it with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, you see it in Libya. And I think this points towards, making sure, as Ban Ki-moon put it, a missile can kill a terrorist, but good governance is what kills terrorism. Okay. So we need to work in all these circumstances in the same way, which is to build strong and inclusive governments that can deliver for their people.
Yes, you said on that there are lessons to be learned from these earlier interventions. In fact, you used the phrase, we learned that we have to be careful about not dismantling states and having plans for reconstruction. That also went disastrously wrong in Libya too, didn't it?
Well, in Libya,
we've intervened, got rid of Gaddafi, and now we're in a terrible mess.
Well, the Libyan people were given the opportunity, and they wanted to. Gaddafi was bearing down on people in Benghazi and threatening to shoot his own people like rats. An international coalition came together to protect those people and to help the Libyan people, who then got rid of Gaddafi. And they had an opportunity to, build what they said they wanted, which was...
You're not saying it's their fault.
No, what I'm saying is that opportunity wasn't taken. I mean, it was a matter of huge regret. A lot of assistance was offered. I took the Libyan Prime Minister to the G8 in Northern Ireland, but for reasons that we can go into, of militias and all the rest of it, it wasn't possible to deliver that sort of government. There's a new opportunity now with the coming together of a Libyan national government to try and deliver that. But the critics of these things, I think, the choice we made in Libya, partly at request of the Libyans themselves, was with the demise of Gaddafi, was not to go in heavy-handed with boots on the ground and troops and try to help them construct their government. They said they didn't want that. They said that would be counterproductive. And they believed they would be able to put together representative institutions. It wasn't possible in spite of the help that was prospered. So if you're saying these things are very complicated and difficult to get right, yes, they are.
No, I'm not. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the humanitarian balance sheet of this intervention doesn't look good, Prime Minister. The failure to engage in nation building has created a breeding ground for ISIL, hasn't it?
Well, we were involved in nation building. We were there to help the Libyan people. We tried to do it in a way that was more remote than what had happened in Iraq, but on this occasion, clearly it didn't work.
Eric Harman.
Thanks very much. Well, compared to the very difficult and intractable issues that my colleagues have raised, I'm going to ask you something which is within your power and you can deal with, and just say yes to both of these propositions, because they're unlike these others. They're about what you do and what your government does. And what I'd like to ask you about is the issue of targeted killing by drones, which you told the House about in relation to a targeted killing by drone in Syria that had been carried out on the 21st of August, and you came to the House to tell us about it on the 7th of September. And I've got two questions about this. The first is, will you agree to the suggestion that you actually set down in writing, publish the policy about targeted killing by drones? Because we've had what you've said in the House of Commons, we've had statements from the Defence Secretary, we've had a number of different statements, but what we haven't had, and you agreed, well, you said when you came to the House of Commons in September, it was a new departure. We need to be clear what the legal basis is, what the operational framework is, and what this policy is. The Americans have published their policy on this. I mean, obviously, the situation is different in Syria now because we voted for the use of force in Syria. But as you said at the time, this could happen. The same issues could be raised in relation to somebody to be targeted, to be killed in Yemen or Libya or some other place where somebody is threatening us and where we can't apprehend them. So the first thing is, this is a serious issue. You've acknowledged that. It doesn't seem too much to ask. Instead of us trying to piece it together ourselves by putting together what you said and the Secretary of State said, and, for example, our own inquiries, like the Select Committee went to RAF Waddington, and they were very helpful about giving us information about the operational framework. But actually, that is not good enough, I don't think. And I would like to put to you that you could easily resolve this by actually having a policy which would deal, for example, amongst other things, is that we've worked out that there are people who are targeted to be killed, on the one hand, that there are people who you don't want to kill, on the other hand, but there seems to be a grey area of people who are not the target, but if they are killed, that's all right. Like the 2 other people that were killed at the time on the 21st of August. And I think we should know who is in this grey area. For example, we've seen Daesh, using young children. If there was a young child there, but who had been involved in Daesh videos, would they be an innocent civilian, or would they be somebody who it would be all right to be collaterally killed during this? What if there was a... Sorry. Okay.
No, I get that. Look, it's fascinating. It's a very interesting... I don't have an absolutely straightforward answer because my view is... Yes, I promise I'll do my best. My argument would be, I set out very clearly in the House of Commons the approach that we take. I explained the legal basis for the approach we take. We don't publish legal advice for well-known reasons you'll be familiar with. But I feel there's a clear policy there. And when you say, why not set it out in the same way the Americans do, the Americans have a sort of far larger and more extensive program that has ranged across Afghanistan and elsewhere. So I don't think the two situations are comparable. What I said was that I always reserve the right, as Prime Minister, to take action to protect a country without asking the House of Commons in advance, but reporting back afterwards, which is exactly what I did, and then I set out the reasons and the legal advice. The question you were asking, as it went on, I was slightly thinking it would be quite difficult to write all these things down in a policy statement that answered every question you were putting in your question and might get us into more difficulties. I mean, the principle is simple, that we only would take this action in the most extreme circumstances where there are no other options available and when we're acting legally. And I also set out very clearly the processes that we followed. So I'm not inclined to try and write some policy statement along the lines you suggest. I think it'd be quite difficult to do. I think what I've said in the House of Commons is sufficient, but I'm very happy to go away and think about it. But I can see some disadvantages in what you're saying, because could potentially write out something that doesn't envisage all the circumstances you're talking about, and then potentially either mislead the British public in some way, because we haven't thought of a circumstance that could occur, or in another way give intelligence, vital intelligence, to the people who might seek to do us harm. That, well, they would know how to
speaking to the liaison committee. He has been talking for about half an hour or so at the moment, answering questions about all sorts of